41 a lot of times, we approach it like it's a feel-good story. Job goes through prison for 2 years. He comes out and look at the reward he gets. He's made second in command to all of Egypt. Wow, he's sitting on the top-notch throne. That's not the point of it all. It's not a feel-good story. This is not a chapter that teaches the payoff for serving God. This is a chapter that teaches us. That truth is there, but this chapter is trying to teach us God is working his process to accomplish his will and using the people he has called to do that. And I know, we forget sometimes that we've been called to help fulfill his purpose. Somebody taught me one time that the Gospel of Luke was the beginning of what Jesus began to do and to teach. The book of Acts was how he continued that story through the early church. But when you get to chapter 28, it's not over. It's not over. God's still writing the history of the church through you and me. I forgot to send out an email. Shame on me with the outline. But if they show up, it's here. I'm sorry, I apologize. Anyway, I really want us to look at some things that are deep in this chapter tonight. And I really believe if we get a hold of what's there, it's going to challenge us, all of us, to really appreciate some things we've never seen before. The first thing, it revolves around Pharaoh's dreams in verses 1 through 8. Look at the text with me, what it says. At the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. Just a coincidence, right? Nah. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. You ever had one of those dreams where it's just weird all over the place and you just wake up out of that dream? It's like, wow. That's what Pharaoh did. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. When morning came, he was troubled, so he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. We talked about last time that dreams were very important in the ancient world then. They still are for a lot of people today too. There was a psychology to it as far as they were concerned. They would have their professional interpreters who were schooled, educated in interpreting dreams. They didn't have God's written revelation, but the Bible says God often communicated to people in dreams. Daniel, he did that with Daniel. He did that with others, did that with Joseph already. The Egyptians felt like their gods communicated to them in dreams. And so they had a field of study in Egypt about interpreting dreams and what they meant. They had manuals, schooling, and all that good stuff. So that's to say they had an importance in their dream interpretation. They placed a premium on that. And for Pharaoh, since he's the king of all of Egypt, since he is a god as far as they're concerned by virtue of being Pharaoh, his dreams are very, very important. So he gets together all these people who are schooled and trained to explain his dreams. And he saw these people They saw these people as having, the dreams are a message from God. So we better listen and we better understand rightly what they say. It's interesting. 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says toward the end of the chapter, God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. They counted on their wisdom. And God made them look bad in all of that. For the ancient Egyptians, when dreams came in pairs, they were considered extra important. And the word, in fact, that was used to describe the one who was called on to interpret the dream was a very special one. They were educated, intelligent, specifically and specially qualified to do that. Moses tells us here, but no one could interpret them for him. No one. Except for Joseph. He's going to be called in. We're going to be shown skills that are going to be so highly valued by the Egyptians that he has. Well, let's read a little bit and then we'll come back and talk about it. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I remember my faults." Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was with us there. We told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had his own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them. I was restored to my position. The other man was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph. And I'm going to stop there for a minute for a specific purpose on doing that. By the way, this is the third pair of dreams in Joseph's life. Remember, when he was at home with his dad, he had 2 dreams. And then when he gets into the prison with the cupbearer and the baker, 2 dreams, one for each of them. And now Pharaoh's got 2 dreams. So another pair in doing that. So this stuff has emphasis, and it's kind of a noticeable way of saying these things are important. Moses wants us to see that they're important. Moses wants us to see how God viewed this in light of what he's doing and what his plan is. The cupbearer comes up and said, "Oh, yeah, you know what? When I was back in prison, I had my offenses, and Joseph interpreted a dream that I had, and the cupbearer had his, or the baker had his offenses, and Joseph interpreted those dreams." Moses, I think, wants us to understand Joseph's dilemma, where he started, and now where it pays off and where he ends up at. Joseph is no longer forgotten. 2 years. Let's see, what's 365 times 2? That's about 700 and some, 730. For 730 days, roughly, Joseph is forgotten. That's a long stretch. You ever had a stretch where you've gone like maybe a month, 2 months, you felt like, forgotten, nobody cares. 2 years. But while Joseph's going to be rewarded and taken care of, this is not his payoff. There's more coming to all of that. And it's kind of interesting now. We'll pick up and look a little bit. I lost where I was at. Oh yeah. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. Well, you look at it and you say, well, that's just kind of, you want to do that. You want to look good before the king. But for the Egyptians, they were clean shaven. They didn't have any beards. It was an unwelcome thing. It was not something good that they could look on. And so he's going to be presentable for the king on 2 or 3 levels, really. And he gets down to to verse 15, he said to Joseph, I've had a dream. No one can interpret it. But I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. No pressure, right? Because all the focus is on Joseph now. You can do this. Watch how Joseph handles this. I am not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. All that Joseph is, everything, all the success, whatever, glory goes to God. He takes no credit for it at all. It's God who's made all of this possible. So, they're going to go through and they're going to retell all the dreams in through this. But Joseph wants to let him know and understand, this is God who's over all of this. God's given the dream, God's given the interpretation. I'm just a servant. I'm just carrying out his plans and intentions. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile, grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, weak, very sickly and thin, came up. I have never seen such sickly ones as these in all the land of Egypt. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. When they had devoured them, you could not tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. In other words, they didn't look fat from eating the fat cows. They looked bad. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 good ones. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing God has revealed to Pharaoh about what he is to do, what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams mean the same. The 7 thin, sickly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless, scorched heads of grain are 7 years of famine. Kind of interesting numerology works in a little bit too, the idea of 7. You know what's interesting? Joseph could have taken on the attitude, you know, I can tell you what all this means, but, you know, maybe you might want to think about how you're going to reward me. I couldn't help but think of some of the television evangelists I've listened to and watched, you know, when they come on the air and they want to, you know, for a price, we'll tell you what God's word says. So anyway, they go on with that. Joseph gives his explanation. In verses 25 through 32. In 28 he says, it's just as I told Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. You know, that's got to be a pretty rough famine to forget what the good years were like when you've had 7 really, really good years. I don't want to get into anything political tonight, but you know, it's tempting to do that. You know, you forget what the good times were like when the bad times show up. So anyway, the famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God and he will carry it out soon. It's not that you've been a bad guy. It's not that I need to show and flex my spiritual muscle here and tell you about all this stuff. I just need to let you know God is working out his will. It's a bigger picture than just you and your country. And so if you'll pay attention, he says it's coming, and you'll be able to understand that more. Joseph isn't one bit concerned about what this will do for Joseph. He's more concerned about how God plays into this. It's God's plan, it's God's desire, it's God's will. Lift up God. Joseph doesn't try to raise up Joseph. Somebody gave me a truth one time and I liked it. It said, when the heart is full of God, the tongue cannot help but speak of him. When the heart is full of God, the tongue cannot help but speak of him. You know, it's like when you give help and counsel and guidance to somebody, do they know the source of your wisdom, the guidance you're giving? You know, and get off on a tangent for a second. I wish we would learn that and remember that when it comes to teaching our children, teaching our friends. Counseling we do. You know, it's wisdom from God's word. It's not me. It's not because I've been to school, got this degree, or learned how to do this. It's wisdom from God's word. And Joseph's very careful to have Pharaoh know that all that wisdom, insight, and understanding comes from God. I can't do it, but my God can and is doing it through me. Verse 33, so now let Pharaoh look for discerning and wise man, set him over the land of Egypt. Notice that he didn't say, you know what, since I interpreted the dream, I think I'd be the guy to put on the place to handle all this stuff. He didn't say that. Pharaoh, look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt, whoever it is. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land. Take a fifth of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. He's given him good, practical, wise counsel on how to do this. Let them gather all the excess food during the good years so that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so that they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by famine. Wow. Find a wise man who will do that. I think that's really kind of me, Pharaoh, you know, if you're listening to what I'm saying, that he doesn't do that. But Pharaoh picks up on it, and Pharaoh understands what's taking place. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. He said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one discerning and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. No pressure. You know, before, you're the one who can interpret. Go ahead. No pressure. You the one gave the plan on how to do this and settle it down. You handle it. No pressure. But Joseph is up to the task because he belongs to God. See, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in his second chariot. Servants called out before him, make way! So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission. And Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, I guess that's right, and gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest at On. And Joseph went through all the land. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, traveled throughout the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvest. Joseph gathered all the excess of food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years. Put it in the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest at On, bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, and said, God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. And the second son he named Ephraim, and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every land. The whole land of Egypt, there was food. When the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. Pharaoh told all Egypt, go to Joseph, do whatever he tells you. Now the famine had spread across the whole region, so Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Every land, it's beyond Egypt, every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain for the famine was severe in every land. At Joseph's promotion, it comes because Pharaoh made the decision based upon what he saw in Joseph, because of what God wanted to be shown about Joseph. Very impressive story when you read it, when you look at it. There's so much more that's deeper in all this. And one of the things I put down there in your outline was some contrasts. Some contrasts in looking at Joseph's life as it relates to Jacob, as it relates to Pharaoh. Here he is in the house of a pagan king. He had spent some time in a patriarch's home. And you would think the patriarch's home would have been better for him. He started off as favored, but now he's again favored. And the irony is, now that he's regained favor, it's in the house of someone who worships a pagan god and who is worshipped as a god. You know, I think Joseph's life before in his father's home must have seemed like a distant dream. Trying to remember. I remember what it was like in the service when you're overseas during the holiday time and you're not home. And you're trying to remember what it was like. They'll be doing this, and we usually do that, you know. But 17 years of that, how much of it is still a clear dream? The second thing was the pagan wealth that he gains here, and the patriarch's gift. Pharaoh places jewels, clothing on Joseph, just like his father had done. Interesting thing is, I wonder if Joseph thought about the day that his dad gave him that multicolored coat, gave him that special status. And the same day his brother stripped him of it, tried to pass him off as dead. And now Joseph's in the wrong land, serving the wrong leader of the wrong nation, not with God's people. And then there's the pagan worship and the patriarch's adoration. Joseph dreamed about his family bowing down to him. They scoffed at that. Pharaoh has no reservation about the dreams that Joseph gave him, and he rewards him for that. You would think the spiritual Jacob would have listened and said, this is a message from God. My son's a very blessed son. I need to listen to him. But he doesn't. Pharaoh does. This one in whom is the Spirit of God, he had said. And then you got the pagan identity and the patriarch's name. He's given a new name. It's an Egyptian name. Not sure what it really means. Probably has something to do with an Egyptian deity. Earlier in Genesis, Moses has told us about name changes. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Jacob becomes Israel. You have those different name changes like that. But on the other hand, you read the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel uh, uh, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get their name changed to reflect Hebrew thinking. They want to wipe out the Jewish way of life. And the same thing is happening here, and it happened earlier with Joseph. Every conquering nation has had a way of trying to wipe out the culture of another nation. We've done it in America. We've really worked hard at it. And it's the way people do when they don't think like God, but that's another story. And then you've got his pagan wife, and yet the patriarch's provision. You remember earlier with Abraham, when he wants to seek a wife for his son Isaac, he makes his servant promise, you go get a wife, but not from the Canaanites. It's going to be from our people. And follows through with that. And then we see a change in chapter 38. Judah doesn't do that. He breaks with tradition for whatever reason on all of that. And now we see that Joseph is doing that, but it's almost like it's more on a deliberate thing. He not only allows it to happen to him, God allows it to happen to Joseph. Going to bring in this pagan influence on you with that. It's a lot more than Joseph just being pulled out of prison, rewarded by Pharaoh, and ooh, look at all the stuff he's got going for him. One of the important things I want you to see, though, is identifying with the people and the land of the covenant. And what's most interesting to me in some ways here is not the dream interpretation. It's not the reward by Pharaoh. It's not the position that he now has. It's what happens with the family. God's going to bless Joseph with children. And we get a look into a glimmer of hope here for who he is. We get to see a little bit of his character. What we've been watching pretty much up to this point has been everybody else in their actions using Joseph, okay? All their actions on Joseph, accusing him, rewarding him. But we haven't really seen Joseph doing much or saying much to reflect who he is since that long time ago that he left his father's homeland as one of the children of the covenant of promise that was made to Abraham. Moses now gives us a little bit of insight into that and shows us he's identifying with the people of the covenant because he gives his children Hebrew names. Now, when you pick out the names for your children, that's always an interesting process, isn't it? You know, who has the most influence to this and that, who we name him after or her and all that stuff. He identifies with Hebrew names. As a slave, he had no choice but to accept the name they gave him. No choice but to accept the wife they gave him. But now at his son's birth, we're seeing he has a choice and he makes that choice. I don't know if he picked the names and she went along with it or how that worked out exactly. He accepted his Egyptian identity. Oh, wait a minute. Had he accepted his Egyptian identity, he probably would have rejected his Hebrew identity. If he'd have said, you know what, I've been gone so long from there, I don't even know what it means to be a Hebrew anymore. I'll just go along with this Egyptian business and do that. But the fact that he uses Hebrew names for his children, to me, seems to reflect his loyalty to his father's household and his fathers before his father, like Abraham and the promise made to him. Joseph's master is an Egyptian. His wife is an Egyptian. His in-laws are Egyptian. His entire world from 17 to 37, 20 years, has been Egyptian. But after 20 years removed away from his homeland and his people, he still has a sense of true identity and allegiance. And I think naming his sons this reflects that. I think Moses wants us to see something like that. He has not forgotten who he is and whose he is, even though he's been in this land a long time. I want you to look at the names a little bit. They're really interesting. But first, I have to take a time out on the field and get a drink. Okay. The first one he names Manasseh. And the book tells us the name means to forget. It's not that he's forgotten his father, not that he's forgotten a covenant community, but he's forgotten the hardships. He's made me forget my hardships. He has chosen to be defined not by the difficulties of his past, but by the promise that gives him hope for the future. I want you to listen to that idea. We're going to come back and hammer on that a little bit. He chose to not be defined by all the difficulties of his past. He chose to be defined by who he was in the present and the hope for the future. That's hard to do. The more difficult the hardships, the harder it is to forget without help. I was talking to a lady this morning, and she told me she had been away from church for a while, whatever that meant. Her father had committed suicide, and she got mad at God. A lot of people do that. Same thing. Why God this? Why God? And walked away from God. It wasn't God's fault, but that's for another study. But it's hard to forget the more difficult the circumstances are. I want you to listen to this. And I ran across this and I thought, this is so incredible. Fella said it's an incredible picture of grace. This naming his son Manasseh, forget, and what it stood for. God alone can be credited with keeping a 17-year-old who's experienced all that Joseph did from becoming a 37-year-old filled with bitterness, resentment, and hatred toward those who had inflicted hardship upon him. That's why I said at the beginning, I don't like this chapter because it gets real personal. I learned some hard lessons as I studied for this. It's a picture of grace of God to show you that you can choose to forget all that was done to you in the past, whatever it was. It's also going to be a picture of grace that Joseph will extend to his brothers later on. For him to give his son a Hebrew name, in some ways was to identify with that murderous band, his brothers, who sold him into slavery. And remember, there was no nation of Israel at that time. There was just the family. And so to identify that way and name your son with a Hebrew name, it was, man, I'm tying back in with them. But what they did has nothing to do with God's overall picture. God's taking care of things. It's an act of grace toward Manasseh himself. Joseph is married to a pagan wife, and if you know anything about moms, moms are going to influence their kids. And so to think about, you've got a pagan wife who's influencing your son who has a Hebrew name. Joseph had not been exposed to the worship of Yahweh for 2 decades, 20 years. And he could have said, I'll just let her go ahead and teach, And then when they grow up, they can make their own decisions. Didn't do that. He didn't do that. Rather than adopt the empty religion and identity of Egypt and just let that be passed along to his son, Joseph gave him a name that would remind him all the days of his life that he's part of the covenant community of servants of the Most High God. When he called him Manasseh, every time he called him by name, it would remind him, you're part of the covenant community. Don't you forget that, boy. Don't you forget that. You belong to God's people. He names the second one Ephraim in verse 52. And this even goes a little bit further in naming this second son. He gives an explanation as to why he chose that name. He goes beyond identifying with the covenant community. In naming him Ephraim, that God's been fruitful to him, he flat out rejects Egypt and all that Egypt has brought him. My father-in-law, when I would bring up some experiences preaching in Arkansas, would tell me, Arkansas has been good to you. And I would argue with him and say, no, they weren't. And I would come back with my statement, say, God was good to me while I was stuck in Arkansas. We were both right. But I had to learn to see it that way. And I finally learned. Joseph has the finest clothes, jewels, chariots, houses, lands at his disposal. He eats the best food of the land. He has the finest entertainment and more. He's living a life of opulent wealth beyond anything he could have experienced if he were still the son of a shepherd up in Palestine. But you know what he calls this life in Egypt with all the opulence? He calls it the land of his affliction. And you think about that one a little bit. It's not the place where he was despised, rejected, and abandoned. That was at home with his dad and brothers. But with his second name, Joseph makes it clear he's not just giving a nod to his heritage. He's identifying himself as a Hebrew among Egyptians. That's very important for us. He's identifying with the people of Yahweh. Joseph is a Hebrew, a servant of Yahweh. He's not an Egyptian pagan. He will never be an Egyptian pagan. He will not give in to that influence. And that's incredible news in light of the rejection he's faced, the hardship he endured, open-armed acceptance Pharaoh lavished upon him. It would have been easy to say, I'm going with the people who love me and who have taken care of me. They've shown that by their action. No, there's something much deeper than that. I'm a Christian. I'm a child of God, a brother of Jesus. And I'm just passing through this world. This world is not my home, the song says. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Paul says our true citizenship, tells the Philippians, it's in heaven. That's where our true citizenship is. It's not in this world. Are you an American? I'm a Christian who happens to be an American, but I'm a Christian first. I don't care what happens politically. I don't care what goes on in this world, because I'm just passing through anyway. It's all just temporary for me. And then notice he's identifying with the land of promise, not the land of Egypt. That's not the land of promise. You know, I think it had to be obvious to him. He's 37 years old now. Yeah, I'm probably never going home again. Never going back to my father's house. I think maybe in some ways he knew that when he left his father's house to go check on his brothers, he was on a one-way trip. Or maybe God reminded him in some way of that. So it would have been easy to say, you know what? I'm in Egypt. I'm just going to be an Egyptian. He spoke the language. He knew the customs. By this time, he spent more time in Egypt than he had anywhere else. So that's where he is. So for all practical purposes, Joseph is an Egyptian. But in his heart, I believe, beat the hope of the promise of God that he had made to Abraham, confirmed it with Isaac, and with his father Jacob. And he's doing that through his sons. And if we don't take the time to teach our children and go from generation to generation, and I'm not talking about a bunch of fluffy Bible stories and a bunch of hoorah sermons. I'm talking about teaching the purpose of God and His will. We need to teach one another and remind one another that what we do today as Christians, we continue to write the history of the Lord's church. You and I are writing our own chapters. Somebody's going to read it someday. And what are they going to find about you and me? Number 5, I want you to notice there are some frustrated dreams. Maybe our situation has been somewhat like Joseph's, in a hole, put on hold. You know, is promotion, is help ever going to come? There are 2 things Joseph did that really impressed me. One is he submitted to God's schedule. 2 full years spent in prison for a crime you didn't commit. 2 hours would be a long time. 2 years? I can't imagine. He's 30 years old when Pharaoh promotes him to the second most powerful position in the land of Egypt. And go back and think about, he's only 17 when he's sold into slavery into Egypt. The boy in Canaan had dreams of, being a man of God, and now he's got to do it somewhere else. He's got to wait 13 years before he gets any kind of a life of freedom. Waits 13 years before one of God's promises would come true for him. Ask yourself this: how long have you ever had to wait? Or have you ever thought about how long you would ever have to wait before you give up on God? I never give up on God. I can't. I might do a lot of things, but I would never walk away from God, and I would never walk away from His people. I can't do it. Any significant character in the Old Testament, New Testament that God ever used in a great way learned how to wait. Just go read the list of names. You've got to wait for God's timing. And there's something about waiting that makes us, give up all of our homemade solutions and plans and lean on God. Learn how to wait. The song, "Teach me, Lord, to wait down on my knees." Well, not just down on my knees, just my life is a life of waiting for God to fulfill what He has in mind for me. People want to go sit down on a chair and wait for the Lord to come back. That's not what the Bible's talking about. It's wrong waiting. It's the idea of a life that says, I'm going to submit to God and I'll let Him take care of things. When are they going to make me whatever? When are they going to let me whatever? Let God take care of it in His time. And truth number 2 is the person who's too great to do something small is too small to do something great. Teach me, Lord, to wait down upon my knees. I'd like to sing the song, but I don't have a voice for it. While in your own good time, you answer my pleas. Teach me not to rely on what others do, but to wait in prayer for an answer from you. Those who wait upon the Lord, quoting Isaiah, will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. Teach me, Lord, to wait. I may say a lot of things and have said a lot of hard things in sermons and classes, but I've never said anything harder than to remind God's people, learn to wait on God. Second thing he did was surrender his own schemes. He told the cupbearer, remember me before Pharaoh. I don't think that was a bad thing necessarily. He's human. But every time you see him after that, everything is about God's interest, not his. The way we usually try to seek position is exalt ourselves, or build ourselves up, or put others down. Build myself up by pushing others down, that kind of thing. Joseph didn't do that. He waited for God. Joseph, when he learned to wait, learned that changing hearts was a specialty of God. Proverbs 21 verse 1 says, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." But here's a couple I'm going to give you as we close out that are really, really tough, that I look in this chapter and see. When you look at Egypt and all that Joseph's got and all that's going on, remember this. This world is the land of our affliction, no matter how good it gets. Do you know the New Testament doesn't make any mention of Joseph's rise to prominence in Egypt? Instead, they focus on the covenant, his choice of covenant over convenience. Over in the book of Acts, Stephen is giving a speech in Acts chapter 7. And beginning in verse 9, the patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. That's interesting. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph. But God was with him and rescued him out of all his troubles. He gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who appointed him ruler over Egypt and over his whole household. Now a famine and a great suffering came over all of Egypt and Canaan. Now he goes over 14 years. And our ancestors could find no food. When Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our ancestors there the first time. The second time, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. Joseph invited his father Jacob and all his relatives, 75 people in all. And Jacob went down to Egypt. He and our ancestors died there, and were carried back to Shechem, and were placed in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. That's the most extensive treatment of Joseph that you'll read about in the New Testament, except for Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 10, that says he was like the others, looking forward to a city that has no foundation. No matter how good it gets in this world, it's all Egypt. All that this world has to offer is just nothing but Egypt. The fellow said there will never be enough gold chains, fine linens, praise, adoration, or anything else to satisfy the yearning God has placed within us. Only his presence with us and the promise of it in the land of promise will satisfy his people. You're not going to find any satisfaction in this world. I don't care how much you have. The only satisfaction you'll find is going to be with God's people. And notice also, God's people are not defined by the difficulties of their past. That one needs to really come home for me. It's impossible, somebody said, to read Genesis 41 without being struck by the response of Joseph to his circumstances. Manasseh, he identifies with the people of God. Ephraim, fruitfulness comes from God. The assurance of knowing that serving God, no matter what the circumstances are, will never be forgotten. And I like this. I found this statement. How can I read Joseph's story and continue to wallow in my hurts, disappointment, and weaknesses? The next time you snap somebody's head off because he or she made you mad, nobody makes us mad, we choose to get that way. Don't reach for the usual, well, it's because I'm a redhead, or I'm just a hot-blooded Latin, or Irish, black, whatever you want ethnically. Stop and ask yourself if your ethnic background, hair color, anger-filled home in which you were raised, or any other condition of your upbringing is a sufficient excuse for sin. Well, that's just my nature, you know. There's no excuse for sin. Besides that, Peter said to us, be partakers of the divine nature. Act like God. God is bigger than your past and my past. He's bigger than anyone who's abused you, hurt you, disappointed you, rejected you, criticized you repeatedly, or even the church you grew up in with all of its backbiting hypocrites. None of that defines who you are today. And none of that's an excuse for you to reject God and his people. Don't be defined by the difficulties of your past. Instead, be defined by the hope that's yours right now, today. And I'm going to cut it short there, and I'll finish it up next week and get into the next lesson that we do that. So keep your outline sheet, and we'll finish tagging on that next week and go from there. This is a heavy-duty chapter. Just remember, everything that's here in this world, it's just Egypt. And that's not our stopping place. Don't let the difficulties of your past define you. Those are good things to teach folks.
Sorry?
Those are good things to teach folks. Any announcements? Anything we need to make mention of here? Not too many of us, so we can take off. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you. Thank you for the study. Thank you for allowing me to learn. Thank you for helping me be more submissive to your will. Thank you for allowing me to share some things with others who are listening and needing more hope in their lives. Thank you for reminding us of who we are and why we are. May we, Father, no matter where we are, remember we are people of the covenant. And our covenant is with you through the blood of Jesus, in whom we hope. And we ask for help and guidance in his name. Amen. Oh. Thank you for being here, folks. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Did I talk loud enough?
I'm sorry?
Did I talk loud enough? Well, me and him are the deaf guys.
Yeah, I'm deaf.
Did you pick up okay?
Yeah. I can't pick it up. Pick up.
There's good stuff. Good stuff in Joseph.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good counseling stuff that would help those people too. You know, and especially with some of the stuff we'll look at next week.